Hello and welcome back to Lady Disdain Reads. It's been a while since I posted a video. I just moved, which explains the bare background behind me. I don't have a nice library shelf yet, but I'm back today to talk to you about a book that I've read recently that I really loved and that I think you would love as well if you're a Jane Austen fan. So today's video is a review of a book by Irene Collins, a historian and Jane Austen scholar. And this book is called Jane Austen, the Parson's Daughter. And if you're looking for a biography of Jane Austen, then I would say look no further, because Irene Collins has so far been my favourite Jane Austen biography that I have read, and I'm going to try to tell you why. If you're new to my channel and you haven't seen my other videos before, then I suggest that you go check out some of my first few videos about Jane Austen, as some of the ideas I discuss in those videos will be brought up here as well. So first of all, for this review of Irene Collins's book, let's talk about style. There is nothing really that grates on me more than a biography where a writer decides to constantly interject with their own opinions of what the person in question might have felt or thought at a particular moment in their lives, and where they have no evidence for that at all. It's just their personal opinion. That really annoys me. And something else that annoys me that you can find in some biographies of Austen is that you can tell that the biographer loves Austen so much, is such an aficionado of Austen, that they can end up being more works of fiction where they explain what Jane Austen would have been like in their minds and in their opinion than works of actual biography. And I must say, Irene Collins does neither of those things in the slightest. In her style, she is clear, she is concise, she's clearly very passionate about Jane Austen, but she is passionate in a way that is still very academic, very scholarly, and unsentimental. Where she does suggest what Jane Austen might have thought or felt at a particular point, it's always linked back to evidence that she provides for us, so that we can be sure that it's not just her opinion, but it is based on what we do know about Jane Austen's life, based on biographical evidence, on her letters, on letters that other people might have written and mentioned her in it, etc, etc. So, now that I've mentioned that I really like Irene Collins' style, let's move on to the actual content of the biography. Why did I like it so much? Well, because Collins was a historian, she clearly is extremely knowledgeable about the social history, the military history, even the church history of the late 18th century and early 19th century when Jane Austen was alive. All of her claims that she makes in her biography are thoroughly researched and backed up by evidence. Nothing she says is just her opinions. And although she never runs the risk of focusing on context too much, to the point where you wouldn't be able to tell that it's a biography of Jane Austen, it could just be a book about the 18th century, she never does that. However, she does really helpfully link contextual points to biographical ones to show us what Jane Austen's experience at different points in her life would have been like based on what was going on around her. So Collins does that really well. Now, what else does she do well? Well, let me summarize just a few of the points that, even as someone who has been reading and researching Jane Austen for years, I found surprising or interesting or worth mentioning. So, let's start with Jane Austen's family. This is one of the things I found the most interesting. For example, a few things I didn't know that I thought were worth mentioning that Collins focuses on. Did you know that Jane Austen's father, George Austen, was a tutor in classics and a chaplain at St John's College in Oxford? Or did you know that her mother, Cassandra's uncle, Theophilus Lee, was master at Balliol College, also in Oxford? I didn't know either of these facts, and that clearly shows to us what an academic family Jane Austen came from, which could potentially explain why her father was so keen to encourage her curiosity and her desire to learn and to try her own talents in writing. What else was interesting? Well, something about her childhood I found really interesting. Did you know that by that point, so in the mid to late 18th century, although some people were starting to criticize this practice, there were still lots of mothers who would give over their child to a wet nurse to be nursed until they were maybe 2 or 3 years old, and to be brought up by this other woman. That's what Jane Austen's mother did with Jane, and she nursed her until she was 3 months old, roughly, and then gave her away to a woman in their village or in somewhere close to them, until she was 2 or 3 years old. I had no idea that this was common practice, and I thought this was really interesting because, as Collins points out, this could be an indication of why Jane Austen appears to have been cold towards her mother, or at least a little bit colder than towards her father in her own lifetime. We can't know this for sure, but it's definitely something worth thinking about, especially because in Jane Austen's novels, it's very clear that there are very few, if any, positive mother figures. So we could potentially link that to the lack of good mother figures in her own fiction. What else? Well, something else that was interesting. Did you also know that at the time it was quite common for rich couples to adopt a child of a less well-off couple if they had no children of their own, and this was not a difficult legal process. So, for example, Jane Austen's brother Edward, he ended up being adopted by the Knights, a family who had no children of their own, and they were quite well off. And that's actually how her brother Edward became a landowner and became more well off than the rest of the family. So lots there about her family history that I had no idea about. And I could tell you more, but then I would never finish this video. So let me tell you quickly a few other things that Collins does particularly well. So, for example, in her chapter on Jane and her sister Cassandra's education and experience at different schools, I think she does a really excellent job of showing to us what was common for a girl of Jane Austen's time to learn, either at home with a governess or with the help of her mother or all the siblings, or at school. What else does she do well? Well, there's also a chapter in which Collins details what it meant to be brought up as a child of an Anglican parson, hence the title, The Parson's Daughter. So everything from why young men might decide to take orders and become clergymen, to the duties expected of them, to their income and their everyday life. Everything is detailed in that chapter, which I think is really excellent, especially because Collins emphasizes the importance of prayer in Jane's day-to-day life, which she would have learned and got from her parents. And she discusses the values that were passed down to Jane, which I found particularly interesting, as my area of research is ethics and virtue and morality in Jane Austen's works. So, for instance, she draws attention to how different Jane's perspective on the idea of duty and happiness would have been from some of our own modern assumptions. We often assume that we need to have a sense of duty to ourselves, to our own wishes or ambitions or happiness. But Collins argues that the Catechism, which is found in the Book of Common Prayer, would have taught Jane that duty mainly meant duty to your neighbour, not really to yourself. So, for example, Collins says this: there were no words outlining her duty to herself. It was George Austen's own understanding as a Christian and as a scholar of the Enlightenment that if she lived in harmony with God and her fellow men, she would arrive at self-fulfilment. It was an understanding that was to form the moral framework of all of Jane Austen's novels. Her characters who experience true happiness are those who think about others. I think that is an excellent point. I think it's really, really true that you can see that in her novels. The characters who learn to think of others, to think of their duty to others, not their duty to their own happiness, are exactly the characters who actually end up achieving a personal sense of happiness. Think about someone like Emma, who doesn't really think about others at first and then is forced, or rather encouraged, to think of those less fortunate than herself. Or think about Mr. Darcy, who also learns to think of himself less and of others more. They both become much happier than they were at the beginning of those respective novels. Now, there is so much more you can learn from this book. So, for instance, if you're interested in how some of Jane Austen's brothers came to join the navy or the militia, so if you're interested in military history and Jane Austen at the time, especially during the Napoleonic Wars, then this is also the book for you. There is a chapter that details that, which I think was really interesting. If you're interested in the importance of dancing in Jane Austen society and of dances, of assemblies or social gatherings, for the structure of a society, so in leading to marriages, for instance, then this is also the right book for you. Or even if you're interested in the Austens' home theatrical performances, which apparently, I didn't know this, but apparently the Austens were very fond of putting on plays and performances during holidays. Well, if you're interested in that, you might be interested in this because you've read Mansfield Park and you've read about the play that they perform in Mansfield Park, then this is also absolutely the book for you. It details that with great, not just detail, but with great clarity as well. Now, as for myself, something I found particularly interesting and satisfying to read about was how much Jane's father, George Austen, encouraged her in her ambition to become a published author, and how much he not just encouraged her, but supported her, pushed her, appreciated her intellect, her curiosity, and her creativity. I also appreciated the detailed and honest discussion of money and the relative poverty in Jane's later life, because of course, although she was never quite poor or destitute, her role as a spinster, depending on her brothers for survival after her father's death, did mean that she lived in what we would call relative poverty for the kind of social class that she was in, which was the landed gentry, or the clergy rather. And I thought this was very moving because, of course, it reminded me that by the time Jane Austen was writing Emma, she was actually closer both in age and in social position to Miss Bates rather than to Emma herself, who is the heroine. And I thought Collins pointed us to this in a very unsentimental way, but in a way that still can show us how difficult Jane Austen's later years would have been, and how potentially destructive to her dignity as well. And finally, I think Collins also deals really well with the long-standing debate regarding why Jane Austen chose not to deal with war in her novels, so in particular with the Napoleonic Wars, which were ongoing when she was writing some of her later works especially. Many think, or have thought in the past, that this is because Jane Austen was ignorant of the war, of exactly what was going on with the war with France at the time, in the Regency era. However, Collins does quite a good job of showing that this is highly unlikely, especially because she would have heard of her brother's experiences in the war, in the navy or militia. And then, in fact, Collins argues that Jane Austen chose to not focus on the war, so she chose not to directly describe battlefields, scenes of actions, death in war, because it simply wasn't what she was interested in. She argues that Jane Austen wanted to mainly entertain her readers, maybe edify them morally as well, but not through scenes of battle, but rather through social interactions. So for Collins, it was a very conscious choice not to write about war, which I found a compelling argument. Now, the last few pages of Collins's book deal with Austen's literary achievements, they deal with her publication history, and finally, they deal with her untimely death. I found this to be the perfect recapitulation of the importance of faith, so the Christian faith in Jane Austen's life. So Collins, as she draws nearer to telling us about Jane Austen's death, decides to quote from one of the prayers that Jane Austen wrote out, which I will read to you quickly. So Jane Austen, in one of her prayers that she wrote herself, says this: "May we now, on each return of night, consider how the past day has been spent by us, what have been our prevailing thoughts, words, and actions during it, and how far we can acquit ourselves of evil. Have we disobeyed thy commandments? Have we neglected any known duty, or willingly given pain to any human being? God, save us from deceiving ourselves by pride or vanity. Collins argues that individuals who grow in moral stature in Jane Austen's novels are exactly those who ask themselves those questions. What have we done today? Who have we hurt? Have we done our duty? And I couldn't agree more. Austen here also asks God for help so that she won't deceive herself, which I found interesting because it reminded me of a previous video I made where I discussed C.S. Lewis's idea that Jane Austen's novels are about characters growing as moral beings to the point where they can finally undeceive themselves. I think both Lewis and Collins do a great job of showing which virtues and principles are important for Austen, and on focusing on the importance of faith and constant prayer in her day-to-day life, which would have led her to show the virtues and the kinds of principles that were important to her in her novels as well. So I would like to tell you once more, for all the reasons that I've mentioned, as well as for the beautiful last few pages of this book that detail Jane Austen's faith, read Jane Austen, the Parson's Daughter by Irene Collins if you're at all a Jane Austen fan, and you won't regret it. I think you'll enjoy it a lot. So I really hope you enjoyed my review today. I'll say goodbye for now, and I'll see you soon for another book on, another video, not another book on Jane Austen. Thank you for watching today. Check out some of my other videos and see you next time. Bye.